Good morning, everyone. It's great to be with all of you. Welcome. My name is Brian Gallini. I'm lucky enough to be the dean here at the College of Law. I'm thrilled to be with all of you and appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, Mark, to launch this morning's program. It really is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the Willamette University College of Law's Housing Land Advocates Symposium. We'll be joined these next 2 days by over 320 attendees who themselves are students, legal scholars, lawyers, advocates, community organizers at the local, state, and federal level, including employees and elected officials from across the globe and across the country. So I looked, and this includes colleagues and peers from the Pacific Northwest, Lewis and Clarke, the University of Oregon, Gonzaga, to those further afield geographically, from Harvard, Yale, NYU, the University of Michigan, and Georgetown, just to name a few. I also want to acknowledge our international friends from Brazil, Germany, France, Romania, and Israel. And it strikes me that one of the silver linings here of the global pandemic is we've been able to provide this event in this format, which gives us the opportunity to widen the scope and the reach of this symposium and have these important conversations in such a measurable and meaningful way. It's also my distinct privilege to welcome and offer my heartfelt appreciation to our keynote speaker, Professor Richard Rothstein. Professor Rothstein is the author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. He's also a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute, the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and of the Haas Institute of the University of California, Berkeley. In addition to his recent book, he's authored many articles and 15 books on race and education. His deep scholarship and advocacy in examining racial segregation, which affects every metropolitan area in the United States, provides us with a useful framework for understanding historical approaches to housing law and urban development, as well as recognizing the long-term impacts and results of systemic inequality that have long been masked as good policy. As he's previously stated, and I quote, "Only after learning the history of racial segregation can we be prepared to undertake the national conversation necessary to remedy our unconstitutional racial landscape." I still look forward to his presentation this afternoon to cap off this first day of our time together. I also want to take just a brief moment to highlight the dedication and hard work and organizing talents of our Law Review Board, and there are many among them to thank, but I also want to recognize the key planners of the symposium, including you, Mark, our editor-in-chief, and Professor Ed Sullivan, who joins us this morning. I also want to thank our communications director, Cindy Cromwell, for her tireless work on assembling promotional materials and making sure that we're all in the same time zone. Collectively, they've all spent many hours pulling together this exciting group of experts in housing policy and law, and it's through that good work that we're all here to learn more about the important topic of housing equity. I want to make a brief plug for the topic and the content that we're lucky enough to hear from today. You know, so many of us, myself included, are secure in the knowledge that we have a warm and safe home to go to each night, but that's unfortunately and unjustly not the case for many of our fellow human beings. The importance and essential nature of housing cannot be overstated. And it's because of this that we're focusing on an area of the law that impacts all of us. And it's no coincidence, after all, that having shelter comes right after having water to drink and food to eat in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And that reminder, I hope, demonstrates just how important this symposium is, noting in particular this event's global reach and the conversations that will follow both today and tomorrow. It's in those spaces I hope you'll find critical opportunities to push the dialogue around the staggering number of legal issues that face our housing in the Western United States and the broader problems of housing equity. I commend you for pushing those conversations, for being here, and to that end, I encourage you all to join each panel, ranging in subjects from housing in the Western United States to housing equity, to HUD in the age of Biden, and to the future of residential land use regulations. Again, thank you for being here, for lending me your kind attention, for your active participation during the symposium, both in the support of our student organizations and expanding and sharing your own knowledge on the issue. It's going to be a great event. I hope you get as much out of these panels and conversations as I will, and I will pass the remote baton to you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Dean. Jennifer Bragar, welcome to the 2021 Housing Land Advocates Conference, our first virtual conference in partnership with the Willamette College of Law and Willamette Law Review. Before we begin, I want to use this introduction to the conference to express our heartfelt thanks and to let the community know what our active volunteer board has been hard at work advocating on over the past year. So first, thank you to Willamette College of Law for providing this virtual conference space that for the first time ever has allowed us to reach an international audience, and for coordinating the participation of our keynote speaker, Richard Rothstein. We would not be here today without the hard work of our conference committee, Ben Schonberger, Ed Sullivan, Sarah Adams Shane, Emily Bussey, and Lonnie Petrullo. Thank you for putting together this great program today, spanning the legal and practical ways we can affect affordable housing development in Oregon and beyond its borders. I know they spent several months coordinating a dynamic group of speakers. In addition, individual board members are actively involved in shaping affordable housing decision-making and policy development, whether on a day-to-day basis or strategically as part of our board work. I want to recognize our founding board member, Ed Sullivan, who along with Taylor Smiley-Wolf, Jean Dahlquist, and Andre Tremblay, participated with an ad hoc racial equity coalition in the Department of Land Conservation and Development's rulemaking to implement House Bills 2001 and 2003, both adopted in 2019, as well as active participation in hundreds of combined hours with the Rule Advisory Committee. These two bills and their implementing rules will offer Oregonians a chance to right historic wrongs as local jurisdictions see the end of exclusive single-family neighborhoods under House Bill 2001 and start to intentionally plan for equity under House Bill 2003 as the state moves towards a regional housing needs analysis assessment. Board member Michael Reeder is representing Housing Land Advocates as our pro bono attorney in our challenge to Metro's urban growth boundary decision that we believe did not account for the possibility of increasing densities within existing boundaries to meet the region's housing needs. The briefs in this case are all available at housinglandadvocates.org. An oral argument is scheduled March 8, 2021. We look forward to providing an update when the court issues its decision. Jean Dahlquist is our post-acknowledgement plan amendment guru who works in conjunction with the Fair Housing Council of Oregon to comment on the adequacy of Goal 10 findings for changes to local government land use code and zone changes. Ed Sullivan, new board member Alexis Biddle, and I helped Jean in this endeavor. Sarah Adams Shane has presented multiple times throughout the year on affordable housing and zoning issues, and is participating on behalf of HLA on DLCD's Climate Change Rule Advisory Committee, bringing an equity and housing perspective to the group. She also recruited our new law student board member, Ariana Buchanan, who just joined the board. In addition, Ed Sullivan introduced us to new board member Frank Hudson, a lawyer who also joined the board last week. Lonnie Petrullo moderated an American Bar Association CLE about homelessness during the pandemic. Lonnie also spearheaded the board's comments to HUD on the once contemplated affirmatively furthering fair housing rule in February of last year. And I worked with Tomasi Salyer-Martin attorney Stephen Thorpe in partnership with the American Bar Association's state and local government section to pass a resolution asking HUD to withdraw the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule adopted without notice and comment in the summer of 2020 and replace it with the 2015 Obama-era rule that would require land use planning to coordinate with housing authorities to end exclusionary zoning practices. The board actively commented in support of an affordable housing proposal by a partnership of private citizens and the local hospital in Lakeview, Oregon, as well as to the city of Milwaukee about anti-displacement language in its comprehensive plan update. If we were in person, I would ask the board members to stand and be recognized. But for now, we will end with the promise to send a follow-up email after the conference to share more about our organization. We are making a difference in the land use planning process every month and look for ways to expand our reach. Today, our focus is on teaching you about what we've learned as a board and learning from you how we can make our advocacy more effective together. Thank you for joining us for 2 days of learning and inspiration. And I'll turn it over to Mark Hansen with the law review. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Gallini and Ms. Bragar. I am Mark Hansen, the editor-in-chief of the Willamette Law Review, and my colleagues are so excited to host this symposium along with the Housing Land Advocates. I think it is worth reiterating that we are very excited that over 300 of you are attending: planners, lawyers, other professionals, housing advocates, and many others who share an interest in housing. You've chosen to join us in this virtual symposium about housing issues facing the US, and I think those are applicable not just in the 3 states we'll first talk about in our first panel, but in the broader conversation. We will share with you some excellent talent from many perspectives from our panels, and look forward to hearing from and interacting with those panelists over the next few days. So very briefly, organization of our panels will roughly follow the same format. Each panelist will give his or her presentation, and then the remaining time will be devoted to panel discussion and answers to your questions. So please submit any questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You should see it there at the bottom right. And the panel moderator will then choose those questions to pose and relay them to the panelists during the discussion. Similarly, Richard Rothstein will make his presentation, the keynote presentation this afternoon, and then respond to your questions following the same format. We have no doubt you'll find every presentation interesting and useful. We're so excited that you're attending. Right now we have 86 attendees logged on, and that number keeps growing. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Sullivan, who's moderating the first panel.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are. I'm Ed Sullivan, and I'm very pleased to be the bridge between Willamette University and Housing Land Advocates. We're going to talk in this first panel about the experience of 3 Western United States that have experienced a great increase in population since the Second World War, and have had concomitant problems with dealing with race and equity. Professor Rothstein's book does a very good job, particularly on the California aspects historically. Just to introduce this topic, California in 1940 had a population of just under 7 million. It's now just under 40 million. Oregon is the smallest of the 3 states in terms of population in 1940, with just about 1,100,000. It now has 4,241,000. Washington has, in 1940, had a population of 1,736,000, and it's now up to 7,700,000. So these states have grown, particularly in their urban areas. They were among the first states to adopt planning and zoning. One of the first 4 cases to come before the US Supreme Court in 1928 was a case out of Seattle. Oregon adopted its first zoning enabling legislation in 1919. California already had its legislation done. All 3 states emphasize, unlike much of America, the requirement of a comprehensive plan and land use regulations that implement that plan. So we're going to take 3 states and take a look at how they've done in dealing with equity and affordable housing. And I'm going to ask Chris Elmendorf to speak first. Chris is a professor at UC Davis, has written extensively in the area of affordable housing and race and equity. And he will tell you a bit about what's happened in California historically and what's going on at the present. Chris.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
And can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Ed, and thanks to Willamette College of Law and the Housing Land Advocates and everybody else who's gathered here today. It's my great pleasure to have an opportunity to offer a few remarks about what's going on in California. And I have titled my remarks, The Housing Element Opportunity. And by the end of the talk, I hope you'll agree with me that we face a really interesting and important opportunity at this juncture. But what comes of it is very much an open question. So let me just lay out for you how California's state level housing framework works. And this is the picture more or less since 1980. So every 8 years, the state projects regional housing need for each of 20 regions. Regional housing need has been defined as forecasted household growth. So basically the state demographer projects population growth trends and projects rates of household formation and then comes up with a number. Actually, they come up with 4 numbers because they disaggregate housing need by the affluence of the household. So there's a category of above moderate income households, moderate income households, low income households, and very low income households. Then, after the state determines this regional need number, regional councils of governments, which is like an association of cities and counties, they vote on a formula to allocate their region's need to the cities and counties within the region. The cities and counties then adopt the so-called housing element of their general plan. And this housing element is supposed to show, along with an inventory of sites, how the city will accommodate its share of need in those 4 income categories over the next 8 years, over the planning period. And that the acronym in California for that city level quantified housing need is called the RHNA, for Regional Housing Needs Allocation. Finally, if the city has to rezone according to its housing element to accommodate its share of regional need, that rezoning is supposed to be completed within 3 years of the housing element's adoption. Sites that are designated as suitable for the lower income need, which is about 40% of the total, generally they have to be zoned at statutory default densities, which is 30 units per dwelling acre, 30 dwelling units per acre in urban counties. So that's roughly what now gets called sort of missing middle housing. It's not high density housing, but it's townhomes and duplexes and triplexes and that sort of thing. So how's it worked? Well, not great, I think it's fair to say, not great. So this is, the figure on the right here is from a legislative analyst report showing the relationship between the median home price in California and the median home price nationally. And you can see that going all the way back to the beginning of this time series, California was a little bit more expensive than other regions of the nation. And that's not so surprising because, you know, California is like a little bit nicer, maybe a lot nicer than a lot of regions of the nation. So there's always been like a little bit of a home price premium in California. But something happens between 1970 and 1980. And that premium goes from being like maybe a 20% premium to like almost 100% premium. And it's in 1980 that California adopts the current form of this planning for housing framework. But you can see that the adoption of that framework didn't do anything to bring down the price premium. If anything, the price premium has grown since 1980. And a few years ago, the legislative analyst took a look at whether, you know, communities were adequately planning for housing, and you know, the bottom line from the legislative analyst was no, they're not adequately planning for housing, as revealed not only by this chart but also by some of the findings that the legislative analyst picked out from particular cities, like cities designating sites that were infeasible to develop to account for their share of regional need. And also the framework presupposing that a city can identify ex ante which sites have development potential, when the reality seems to be, although the data is still spotty on this, that a lot of the development that does occur is not actually on the sites that the city designated as suitable for housing. And since this report was 2017, the other report was 2015, and these reports, together with a lot of organizing from a new YIMBY, or Yes in My Backyard movement, generated a whole suite of legislative reforms that were adopted roughly from 2017 to 2019. So cities are now embarking on the 6th planning period, adopting their 6th cycle housing elements. This is enumerated since 1980. And as they go through the process during the 6th cycle, they are realizing that it's quite different. So what is different now? Well, first, the housing targets are a lot bigger in the expensive regions of the state. So for the Los Angeles metro region, the housing target, the regional housing target, is 3 times larger than it was in the last planning period. In the San Francisco Bay Area region, it's about a little more than 2 times larger than it was in the last planning period. And it's larger because of state statutes that change the criteria for determining regional need so as to account not just for projected household growth, which is in some sense a consequence of previous land use regulation, but also to account for indicia of unmet present need, such as high rates of cost-burdened households and high rates of overcrowding. As well, the legislature passed a bill that established more specific criteria for allocating that need within regions. These include fair housing criteria, which are having the effect of requiring cities that are historically exclusionary to accommodate a larger share of the low income need in particular. And the legislature said that the fact that a city hasn't grown in the past is not a basis for a downward adjustment to its share of regional need. In other words, a city that erects the barricades around it, keeps out newcomers, can't then use that as a justification for a smaller share of regional need. A second thing is that the state is getting much more realistic about what is the capacity of a given site to accommodate housing during the planning period. And the most important idea to come out in thinking about this, and it's most implicit in the statutes, but it starts to be more explicit in the guidance that the State Department of Housing and Community Development is giving to cities and counties. The most important idea is that cities have to make some adjustment to account for sites' likelihood of development during the planning period. Right? So previously the assumption was if a site is suitably zoned and it has the potential to be developed, then it will be developed. But that's obviously false, right? That's like saying, well, we want to have 200 students in our incoming law school class, so we're going to admit 200 students for our law school class, right? You know that each of those admitted students has the potential to come to your law school, but you also know, based on past experience, that a lot of them will choose to go somewhere else, or maybe choose not even to go to law school at all. And sites are the same thing, more or less, right? Sites that have potential to be developed might be developed over the next 8 years, but lots of other things might happen to them too. And so if cities take realistically this idea that sites have only a probabilistic chance of being developed, then they have to provide much more capacity ex ante to accommodate their share of need. Third, the state says now that housing elements must affirmatively further fair housing. So that Obama era fair housing ideal has been codified in California law. There's some problems with it. We can talk about it more in the Q&A. But for the first time, this is giving the state housing department some leverage over the intra-city, that is the within city siting of capacity for new housing. Finally, it's now much harder for cities to deny projects whose density is consistent with the general plan, including the housing element, or consistent with applicable zoning. We can talk more about those details again in the Q&A if you're interested. So all of this means that the framework now has more bite than it has had in the past, and is going to require cities to rezone a lot more land. And maybe most important, we have a new group of interest groups, YIMBY groups, that are paying attention to the process and that are able to monitor what's actually happening in cities and then relay that information to state agencies, the State Oversight Agency. So I realize that I have only about 4 minutes left, but my conjecture here is that this 6-cycle housing element update is going to be the single best opportunity for pro-housing reform at the city level in California for the next decade. Why is that? Well, first, NIMBY interests, the interests that normally oppose rezoning for greater density, they have an incentive to compromise and to make a deal on the adoption of a housing element. Because if a city is not able to adopt a compliant housing element, then under state law, the city actually forfeits its authority to apply its zoning code or general plan to 20% low income or 100% moderate income projects. So that's a really drastic remedy. There's questions about how practical it will be to use, but cities are worried about it. And so anti-housing interests are worried about it. So this is an opportunity to get to the table and to negotiate a deal where the side that usually says no has an incentive to compromise. Second, whatever deal is struck, the housing element can be used to make it sticky. That is hard to undo, both because the so-called fundamental, mandatory, and clear provisions of the general plan supersede contrary provisions of local law. It's like a constitution for development. And because amendments to the housing element have to be approved by the state housing department, or at least reviewed by the state housing department, which could respond by decertifying a housing element if the amendment is a very bad one. Third point, the housing element update foregrounds citywide and regional interests, whereas most rezoning and land use adjustments take place on a parcel by parcel or neighborhood by neighborhood basis. And in that highly localized setting, neighborhood interests tend to predominate, whereas if you have a citywide interest or a citywide perspective or a regional perspective, other groups have an incentive to get involved. And finally, what the housing framework amounts to in practice depends a lot on local knowledge. The state agency has limited capacity to figure out what's actually going on at the ground level. And through this now flourishing YIMBY movement, there's much more bottom-up input being provided to the state agency about inadequacies in cities' housing plans. So that's all I have to say for now. Happy to discuss further during the Q&A, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from my co-panelists about developments in Oregon and Washington. Thanks again.
Thank you, Chris. Robert Liberty is our next presenter. I've had the privilege of knowing Robert for about 40 years. He started as a lawyer for a public interest group, 1,000 Friends of Oregon, and later became its executive director. He also served as a hearings officer for a number of jurisdictions, and then became an elected official, a member of the Metro Regional Council, and in that capacity dealt with Metro's efforts in housing. He has also been an academic at the University of Oregon and at Portland State, and recently became a planning consultant with Cascadia Partners. Robert's going to talk to you about what's happened in Oregon and its prospects. Robert.
All right, can everyone hear me? Yes? Thank you, Chris. I learned a lot. I appreciate hearing that update. For those not in Oregon, I want to provide a little demographic context to the state. As you can see, it's not as diverse as the United States as a whole, but when it comes to median household income and level of education, it's pretty much like the United States, a very average state. in that sense, probably lower income and lower level of higher education than its states, its neighbors to the north and south. You can't understand the history of residential zoning reform in Oregon without understanding its intimate connection with the state land use planning system. Senate Bill 100, who was chief advocate was Governor McCullogh, shown here in the photo, was a decisive break with the idea of local control. And we have not gone back to local control. So this is the basic framework. Conserving land outside urban growth boundaries for food and fiber production and natural resource protection was integrated with more compact and intensive use of land inside urban growth boundary, especially lands designated for housing. Here are the urban growth boundaries in Oregon. Every city in Oregon has an urban growth boundary regardless of size. In some cities with population smaller than this webinar, they have urban growth boundaries. This is the urban growth boundary for metropolitan Portland. It includes 23 cities and urbanized parts of 3 counties. This is a figure ground from the New York Times. That is, the black are buildings. And you can actually see that just the image of buildings reflects the urban growth boundaries. Urban growth boundaries really are effective in separating city and country, and you can see that in small places like Monmouth Independence. The urban growth boundary is visible from space. Now, the other side of this, which relates to housing, reflects Governor McCullgh's interest in this issue and urban issues. This is him at a meeting on housing supply issues in the African-American community. The gentleman on the right, by the way, may look familiar. It's Carl Rowan, the noted columnist. So for McCullogh, it was always a package deal to deal with what's inside the urban area and what's outside. So I'm going to describe first what happened in the 1970s, 80s as the platform, what has happened more recently. So exclusionary zoning was broken at the municipal level, not the neighborhood level, but the municipal level in the 70s and 80s. Every city had to plan for and zone land for all types of housing: apartments, townhomes, manufactured homes, small lots, everything. Local governments could not use home rule to block affordable housing projects. And in the Portland metro urban growth boundary, the state mandated minimum density targets for new residential development. Now, an early case on the housing goal, which was directed at reforming zoning, is Seaman v. City of Durham. And this was a decision by the Oregon Land Conservation Development Commission to apply to a plan amendment zone change in the suburb of Portland, Durham. And this is their conclusion. Nothing in the record suggests that Durham, in amending its plan, gave any consideration to low-cost housing needs of its own residents and workers, much less those of the region. The record clearly shows that a contrary intent, namely to decrease the diversity of housing types and prices. Such planning runs contrary to the purposes of Goal 10. The Commission finds that the Durham City Ordinance violates Goal 10 for the reasons set forth here, and the ordinance is therefore invalid. So you have an agency striking down a rezoning because of its exclusionary effect. What was the aftermath? Well, this is an important part of the story that's often neglected in talking about laws, is a contract planner by the name of Chris Nelson, shown there now in later years, who has a very distinguished national career, convinced the city of Durham that it really was going to have to comply. And so they zoned some land for apartments. And ironically, one of the chief opponents of this later moved into one of the apartments. So actually, this enforcement action kind of broke the dam, and many suburbs then went ahead and rezoned as required. There are also a bunch of procedural reforms. One was the state said, from now on, clear and objective review standards for housing. None of this fit into the character of the neighborhood. Use numbers, use something that is clear and objective. There was a 120-day limit for making local decisions on applications for permits. There was an expedited appeals from local governments to the State Land Use Board of Appeals. The State Land Use Board of Appeals is a statewide land use court. It functions like a appellate tribunal, so there's no trials of land use matters. And very importantly, both the state and non-governmental organizations did a lot of monitoring, oversight, and enforcement. So what are the results? So it's too complicated to talk about the results statewide, so we'll focus on the Portland, Oregon metro results. So between 1978 and 1982, there was a 320% increase in land zone for multifamily, especially in the suburbs. And this map, something I asked for when I was at Metro, is a snapshot of 100,000 housing permits approvals. and the dark blue are apartments. And so you can see it's not perfect, it's not completely evenly distributed, but apartments were built straight across the region, including in the growing suburbs. This is what happened with the minimum lot size in single family residential zones in the metro area. It went from almost a quarter acre, it's now below 5,700 square feet now, but this was a direct result. You can see the big drop between 78 and 82 and then 82 to 95 of these planning requirements. A lot of housing was built, a lot of variety, including subsidized affordable units like the project in the upper left. And it led to this remarkable headline in the Oregonian back when that was the actual newspaper in 2002, income groups intermingle, land use planning nurtures economic integration, Portland census data shows. So this was contrary to everything that was happening in metro areas across the United States. Betsy Hammond wrote this article looking at the census data. So class segregation, we don't talk about as much as racial segregation, but it is just as pervasive and just as serious of an issue. So we were making real progress. If you want to know more about this era, you can read this law review article and you can join the 25 people who've read it previously. So far, so good. Then, Portland became a destination, both for employers and a lot of people. And so we entered into a period of very rapid growth, not just Portland, but Oregon. So not surprisingly, this phenomenon familiar to many people now in many parts of the United States, including places like Montana now. 14% increase in rents in 2 months. This home, a solid middle-class home, sold for $161,000 in 1998, goes for more than $500,000 18 years later. And it was not a phenomenon limited to Portland, so communities across the state that had high amenity value had soaring home prices and completely unaffordable. Our incomes, again, are less than our neighbors in California and Washington. So the first thing that Oregon did, and much to its chagrin, it had to follow California by a year in authorizing accessory dwelling units in all cities with population over 2,500 and counties with a population over 15,000. So these local governments had to authorize accessory dwelling units on single family lots. But the big achievement, as Jennifer mentioned, was House Bill 2001, passed in the last 2 days of the 2019 session. First statewide legislation reforming single-family residential zoning. And it would not have been possible with all this prior effort under Goal 10 and the work in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. What did it do? So inside cities over 25,000 population, and inside pretty much everything inside the Portland metropolitan area growth boundary, single family lots, local governments must change their zoning law, duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes on single family lots. They also have to allow townhomes and where there's lot size big enough, cottage cluster housing, so-called middle housing. It also is once again going after delay and discretionary standards. That includes this requirement: siting and design regulations must not individually or cumulatively discourage the development of all middle housing types permitted in the area through unreasonable cost or delay. We're going to find out what that means probably through enforcement proceedings. In cities of 10 to 25,000, that is inside the urban growth boundaries of those cities, duplexes must be allowed on all single family lots. And of course, accessory dwelling units are already allowed. It got rid of some of the poison pill provisions that frustrate ADU construction, which is owner occupancy requirement. It also prohibits requiring off-street parking, except in resort areas where vacation rentals are crowding out market long-term housing. A few other provisions. There's a new alternative building code being developed to facilitate remodeling single-family homes into multifamily housing. Why do you need to do that? Because the multifamily housing code is a commercial code, so the requirements don't really fit adapting existing homes. And it prohibits new covenants, conditions, and restrictions that block the construction of middle housing or ADUs. California went farther, very interesting, and invalidated existing covenants blocking ADUs. So it goes into effect for small cities at the end of June this year, the end of June next year. And as is parallel to what you heard in California, the state has already adopted a model zoning code. So if you don't get the work done in your city, it becomes the default zoning if it misses the deadline. And the state model housing ordinance, by the way, it's actually a pretty interesting document itself. You can find online, includes these diagrams about how to accommodate the housing units on single-family lots. Now, when the rules were adopted, and they were adopted in December, this is an important part of the story. That is House Speaker Kotek. This is her letter to the Land Conservation Development Commission. Well, I believe the proposed rules mostly meet the intent of the legislation. I have strong concerns I have strong concerns about several parts. I would like to align my, I'd like to align my comments with the concerns raised by the Fair Housing and Racial Equity Coalition, their memorandum to you dated October 26th in November. Not surprisingly, the Land Conservation Development Commission revised their rules to accommodate the House Speaker. So this is close scrutiny by one of the advocates on the follow through. How did this happen? Well, one reason is House Speaker Tina Kotek, who made this a top priority. The other was this coalition around housing, which is a big spectrum of groups that were advocates for racial justice, access to housing, land use planning, and so on. So it's really a grassroots as well as legislative leadership. So House Bill 2003 is something I played a role in getting started. And this is we already have a housing needs analysis built into the planning program, but this is more rigorous. It applies to cities over 10,000, 68-year cycle. It requires a housing production strategy with specific actions, including providing incentives, and a state pilot regional housing needs analysis to look at broader areas where the housing market goes beyond cities or across urban growth boundaries. I think what this is really about is setting the stage for more legislative intervention if the local governments don't show results. Now, onto the city, which has had Portland its own 40-year history, 50-year history of residential zoning reforms. They include authorization, deregulation of ADUs, increased land zone for multifamily housing, decreased and eliminated multifamily parking requirements. This is what happened with accessory dwelling unit permits between 2011 and 2018. So they skyrocketed. There were a couple of reasons. One of the reasons was waiver of system development charges. Now this volume is not sustained. It's more like a couple hundred a year, but it's perfectly possible to wander through many neighborhoods in Portland and see accessory dwelling units on every block. We know from research we commissioned through Portland State that a chunk of them, 44%, are rented at below market value. And the regional government in 1991 did the same thing as Portland had. It made local governments authorize ADUs across the region. This is Southeast Division Street in Southeast Portland. And I want to show you the effect, I think, largely of parking deregulation. So 2010, 2019, none of those apartments were required to have on-site parking. Not. Now, some of them have a modest amount, but there was no requirement. And it's pretty clear that it was the elimination of the parking requirement made a difference in the feasibility of the construction of these apartments. In 2017, the city adopted an inclusionary zoning requirement, applies to apartments with 20 more units. And it's tied to meeting performance targets of either 60% of median family income or 80%. 700 units have been produced, and you can see they're scattered pretty much across the city. But this is the big achievement from August of last year, the residential infill project, a 4-year highly contentious process. The yellow shows the residential zones where these new regulations will apply. And it's pretty much everywhere except for exceptionally steep forested slopes. Too complicated to go into all the details, but it's, I think, a very astute, both politically and substantively, combination of tying floor area ratio entitlements to the maximum number of houses. So I'll give you an example. So it was possible, it's still possible, to build a 6,750 square foot home on a 5,000 square foot lot. I can tell you those are not popular in Portland because they're giant. They house 1, 2, or 3 people. There's no yard lot. So that was something where NIMBYs and YIMBYs had some agreement. So in exchange, what you see on the right is the maximum size allowed for a single family dwelling. So we reduced the maximum size for single family dwelling in the city of Portland to 2,500 square feet. But if you have more units, you get more FAR. For example, 3,500 square feet for duplexes. You can have 3 and 4 plexes up to the same height, but one of them has to meet the visitability standard, which is not quite total ADA accessibility, but it's allows greater access for people with some disabilities. And then going beyond the state requirements of allowing up to 6 plexes at 6,000 square feet, but they have to have some units affordable at 60 or 80% of median household income. Allows cottage cluster housing in single family zones, and now 2 accessory dwelling units, 1 that's internal attached and 1 detached. Some other fixes: no additional on-site parking is required, allowing some small lots and flag lot designs, and a lot of design standard changes. So how did this happen? Well, you're looking at a major reason, the Planning and Sustainability Commission, which went beyond what the staff was willing to do. And I think the city council was happy to let them lead. So there was many, many contentious hearings because they made this a lot more ambitious. And it was made possible because, as a tradition in Oregon, active grassroots participation. When I went to hearings, the YIMBYs at least equaled the NIMBYs, and toward the end, they outnumbered them clearly. So this was a grassroots supported effort. So what will be the results of both this landmark legislation and the ordinance? Well, this is what we know. The law and the ordinance is going to be translated in form residential zoning. Why? Because we've been doing it for 30 or 40 years. So that's a no. Unknown, whether, how much, and when the newly authorized housing will be built. And unaddressed, helping moderate and low-income homeowners and renters to benefit from these changes other than through the filtering process. That's the next challenge. So finally, an addendum about how we learn about these things. I think typically there's an overemphasis on the content of the law, rule, or plan, underappreciation of the details and politics of implementation, underappreciation of the roles of advocacy groups like housing and land advocates, and underappreciation of nonprofit private business roles in translating zoning into housing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. Just a note before I introduce our last speaker for this panel. You have a question and answer facility at the bottom of your screen. We only have 1 question posed. I will pose the questions that are in that box, and I will also let the panel members robustly talk to each other and the audience about a comparison of how their state fits with other states, either on the West Coast or nationally. So Jessica Clawson is our last speaker. Unlike the first 2 speakers, she's an active attorney and throughout her career has dealt on the development side. She is a graduate of Whitman College and Seattle University Law School. She's a partner in McCullogh Hill in Seattle and has been engaged both in planning and zoning litigation. So let's hear the Washington perspective, Jesse.
You all can hear me okay, I presume, yeah. Yes?
Yep.
And you can see my screen? Okay,
Yep.
good. Well, I'm a little disappointed hearing everything that Oregon and Washington is doing, or Oregon and California, because I'm going to tell you that Washington is way behind. That is, I think, a fact. It's definitely an opinion, but I think it's also a fact. So just going over kind of the main housing planning tool that we have in Washington, it is the Growth Management Act, very similar to the structures in California and Oregon. We'll talk about a couple of legislative efforts that, look, one has been successful already, one may be successful this year, that are, I think, baby steps at a statewide solution following California and Oregon's, I think, path. And then, I'm just going to talk about some of the other problems that we see and then possible solutions. So the Growth Management Act is our main planning act here in Washington, and it was passed in 1990. It has several goals related to, how do you do your comprehensive plan, what you need to include in your housing plan, how you have to do your land analysis and your buildable lands analysis. So the housing element is that 070 you see. It also, the act does not, it requires cities and other jurisdictions, counties, to plan for affordable housing. It talks about including affordable housing incentive programs, but we'll talk about later how that's not greatly enforced. So getting into how these cities and jurisdictions create housing plans. So the Department of Commerce does population projections. So the Department of Commerce is our statewide department, and they figure out how many jobs and how many people each county is going to get, and the word they use is must accommodate, and so that's already kind of being a little bit negative. Every 5 years for the next 10-year period, so they date them every 5 years, and then each county employs or does a buildable lands analysis to ensure that each urban growth area, which is very similar to what Oregon has. I think we may have stolen that from Oregon. It's our urban growth boundary where, inside you have to be urban and at an urban density, which is not defined by the act. And then outside you have to be at a rural density. So each county figures out, does a county have enough land to accommodate the number of people that are coming? And then it directs growth to each planning jurisdiction, to each city. And then the jurisdictions get to plan however they want. And this is really, I think one of the themes in this talk is what's the good balance between more either federal or state control versus local control, and what can happen when you have too much local control, like I think we might in Washington. So I'm just going to go through kind of in King County how this works, and I'm going to talk about a suburban jurisdiction called Mercer Island, which is a very small, large landmass, but small suburban city just east of Seattle. So here's the Department of Commerce's numbers most recently in terms of population changes. So you can see down at the bottom, King County is going to grow by 329,000 people. The other thing that I think getting ahead to problems possibly is these numbers have been not necessarily very correct. Nobody could have foreseen Amazon other than Jeff Bezos. He definitely foresaw it. Nobody could have seen the insane growth that we've had in King County and in the Puget Sound region generally. And so these numbers are also a little bit off. So then King County does the math. They figure they take the number that the state gives and they divide it by household size, turn it into a number of units, and then out pops the number of units that they need to accommodate in their buildable lands. And then they figure in King County, this is specific more to King County. I'm not sure. I think Pierce and Snohomish may do this. Then they figure out the percentages of where people are already living, really, and say, okay, in a metro city, which is really Bellevue, Seattle, this is how much growth we think is going here. Smaller sub-cities, and then in the rural areas, they do designate units to the rural areas. And then all of the planners of all the cities and the county get together and they figure out who gets the growth. And so this is the 2011, it's what I could find, and it was adjusted again in 2015. So they should have updated again in 2020. COVID could have interrupted it. But you can see, most of the growth is given to Seattle. Bellevue has, in my opinion, too low of an amount. And then the other suburban cities have some. And so, and City of Mercer Island isn't on here because it's a small city, but we can walk through how it works. So City of Mercer Island also gets some growth. In this growth target, they were given 2,000 units. And you can see they're kind of round numbers. So there is definitely some wheeling and dealing that happens between the planning folks. And then adjusted upward in 15 again to accommodate 320 more jobs. So this is how much growth the City of Mercer Island is supposed to accommodate. I will say that in Mercer Island, it's a very large landmass. It only has about 200 acres out of about 2,700, I believe, that are even zoned other than single family. And in their comprehensive plan, they actually say that 95% of their single family zoning is already built out. Not to say that you couldn't build a few more units out there, but they really are trying to put the growth in the town center. But in the town center, they don't have significant zoning. So affordable rents, and I know others later in the panel will talk, or later in the symposium will talk about this, but here are the affordable rents for this year stated by King County. And it's typically by AMI, figure out how many people are living in it, how large the unit is. These are the average prices in Mercer Island. So the average price to purchase a house is 1.4 million, and it's probably going up as we speak, literally. And then the average rents, and this isn't an average rent, but this is a typical apartment building in Mercer Island Town Center. The interesting thing about the planning regime in Washington is that the real back checker on whether or not a jurisdiction is doing a good job planning is the public. And so if the public, and most are, who's paying attention to the Mercer Island Comprehensive Plan? Probably nobody, except if you live in Mercer Island. And frankly, there are many people that live in Mercer Island that are, the truest NIMBYs of the NIMBYs. And so Mercer Island's comprehensive plan itself states that it does not have enough zoned capacity for the number of units. If you actually look at the numbers, it identifies that it does have an issue with affordability. One of the other big issues in Washington State is, while the the Growth Management Act does state that you need to plan for affordable housing and plan for housing affordable to all levels of incomes, there are no actual targets for that. And, as you can see, to buy a house on Mercer Island, it is definitely not affordable. To rent an apartment that's at a family size, 2-bedroom, 2+ bedroom, is definitely not affordable. And so that's a huge problem, I think, in Washington State, where we don't have those targets. So, talking about solutions, I think we should definitely remedy them. Another thing that's happened in Washington is we have, as you can see, the delegation of units to each city. Seattle has really actually done, despite, the idea that so much of Seattle is zoned single family, Seattle, because of the coalitions that, have already been mentioned, we have a similar thing, Seattle for Everyone in Seattle, done a great job of zoning for multifamily and getting units in Seattle. The suburbs have done a terrible job. And so now it's up to the suburbs to really take on their responsibility to allow people to live in those cities, especially now when we have so much job growth going on the east side. The job growth is really headed to Bellevue, to Redmond, and Mercer Island is a community that is literally in the middle of Seattle and Bellevue. So allowing for more people to live in those communities rather than, making those employment centers and making people live farther and farther out, I think is what we need to do. The recent legislative efforts in 2020, HB 18, so last year it was HB 1823 passed. It was a good first start, which the legislature now allows and gives money toward jurisdictions who want to plan for additional density around transportation hubs. It also, for jurisdictions that choose to plan in certain ways, it decreases the amount of SEPA, that's our CEQA, State Environmental Policy Act appeals, that would occur either on those planning efforts or on individual projects. So it's a start, but it's all May. Just so you know, there's no minimum density requirement. There's nothing, you know, saying coming down from on high like we've got going in California and Oregon saying this is what you must do. And then HB 1157 is this year. It's kind of gasping for breath right now. It does more of the shall. I mean, I think 1823 was the beginning of something, and 1157 is another start in the right direction. I'll just tell you, there's probably a lot, I don't see who's on the call, but there are a lot of big local control advocates down in Olympia on behalf of the cities and counties who either believe that things are you know, an unfunded mandate, which could be fair, or that you know, really are concerned about the political issue of, you know, if they're elected officials, many of them, and I will say that is absolutely true in Mercer Island, were elected specifically to do something about growth, and do something about growth is meaning to stop growth in their communities. On the east side of Seattle, we've had 4 moratoria on multifamily dwellings in Issaquah, Mercer Island, Sammamish, and Mercer Island had a couple of them in the past like 5 years. So it is really a political thing. The other thing that 1157 does is it's actually trying to get to that idea of how do you incentivize these local jurisdictions to do these things. And if jurisdictions plan in the ways outlined by the bill, they would get a percentage of the real estate excise tax back in their budget. So recognizing that, you know, as with my private developers, the best incentive is a financial incentive, hopefully, to do these types of things. So again, you know, we're not even going into the other things that cities do that that make housing expensive to produce, make it take a lot of time to produce. Housing has a lot of regulatory hurdles. You know, we have design review regimes that are uncontrolled, unlike Oregon. I love that bill that states that it can't create undue delay. That is, you know, neighborhood character rules and design review rules are one of the biggest things getting in the way of quick production of housing. And then, of course, there's no requirement, as I stated, to plan for affordability, no requirement or coordinated effort to reduce cost of housing. I mean, and this is all just by individual jurisdiction. If jurisdictions want to bear the burden of what they're doing, it's politically very difficult to do. So with that, I guess I think I only have a couple of minutes left, and we can do questions. I had a little bit more to talk about, but I don't think I'll be able to get through it. It has to do with how some of our very well-meaning energy and climate regulations are actually creating more costs as it relates to housing production. I think from a policy perspective, you got to step back and say, okay, what are we trying to do here? In Washington, our energy code is very, very, very stringent. And in Seattle, it's even more stringent than the state building code. So the relative gains of energy conservation and greenhouse gas emission reduction are, you know, it costs, on one project, it was, you know, $6,500 a unit to comply with the Seattle Energy Code, which is only getting you a tiny, tiny fraction of more efficiency. So it's, we have to think about where we put our policy focus, I guess. So with that, my final thing to say is that Washington is super behind. And we need to get it together, and I don't know what our problem is. So I'm excited to hear more from Oregon and California about, like, what the heck can we do?
Okay, thank you, Ms. Clawson. We now turn to questions and answers, and I'm going to take a question that was given to me by another panelist and doesn't show on the Q&A. Robert, and then Chris particularly, because you both spoke about it. What about covenants, conditions, and restrictions that come with deeding over pieces of property that are part of a development? Robert, you've already told us that Oregon now prohibits those prospectively. Tell us to what extent this is a problem in Oregon and what to do about it. And Chris, tell us, California has done this retrospectively and attempted to invalidate existing covenants. How's that working out for you? And Jesse, if you have anything to add from a Washington perspective, please do. So Robert, why don't you respond first?
Most of my answer is I don't know how serious the problem is. I did listen to the discussion before the Land Conservation Development Commission on how extensive these are. They tend to have been planned unit developments from the latter part of the last century, a few particular neighborhoods. I think in terms of land coverage, it's not a very large percentage, but it may be higher income area. So in that sense, it's more of an equity issue. That's about all I can say on the subject, and maybe Chris can be more enlightening. And actually, Chris, and I think I asked this of Ed, I wanted to know why Oregon chose to do it only prospectively and whether that was a political decision or something perhaps at a state constitutional level regarding contracts. Maybe you know the answer to that with respect to California.
Chris?
So I can say that under background principles of property law clarified by the third restatement, there's always been a judicial assessment of whether covenants are acceptable in the public interest, right? This was traditionally called the touching concern doctrine. Under the third restatement, it's a explicit public policy inquiry. And I think that under that doctrine, a court, even without action by the legislature, could point to a legislative policy to accommodate affordable housing and declare that a single family home restriction in a covenant is unenforceable if the zoning has been changed to allow fourplexes. So if that is in fact right as a description of the background common law of property, then the legislature has a lot of discretion to step in and say this set of covenants is in fact, in our view, against public policy. California has done that with respect to solar panels. California has done that with respect to home-based daycares, and California has now done that with respect to accessory dwelling units. And I know anecdotally that it's an issue beyond accessory dwelling units, that developers actually on sites in housing elements that have been designated for affordable housing have run up against covenants that make it impossible for them to build. I don't know that there has been any litigation over that question specifically. I think what the Homeowners Association would say would be, well, so long as there's some other place where you could put that multifamily housing, you know, our covenants should be enforceable. But I think it's an open question under background principles of property law, and therefore there's a lot of leeway for legislatures to do what they think is reasonable.
Okay. Ed, could I ask Chris a question on this? And maybe this is too narrow, but do you think, Chris, then when you have state legislation that's clearly articulating the need to override and replace local zoning, does that then inform a judicial review of a covenant saying, well, we now have a statement of public policy that this is contrary to this public policy?
Yes, that's my view, is that it should. But again, I don't know of any cases yet where a court has been asked to rely on general expressions of legislative policy in favor of affordable housing or middle housing and use that to invalidate a single family home covenant. But I think the basic legal principles are in place for a court to reach that conclusion.
Jesse, anything in Washington?
Yeah, it hasn't come up in the ADU context yet, But it did come up, gosh, 10 years ago in the minimum zone density context, a really beautiful place called the Highlands, one of the original, suburbs created by Bill Boeing, just north of Seattle Golf Club, sweeping views, big lots. The City of Shoreline's comprehensive plan was challenged on the base that there weren't urban densities as required by growth management in that area. And the state Supreme Court, and it was due to these private covenants. It says there's minimum lot sizes and only one unit per lot. And at that time, this was 10 years ago, the state Supreme Court sided with the Highlands and the homeowners up there who were fighting to maintain these low densities. Specifically because there aren't minimum densities called for in the Growth Management Act, and specifically because this very clear statement of legislative policy was not, or legislative intent wasn't in the act. So for now, they're able to maintain those. I think, again, like Chris said, if there is that very clear statement of intent in Washington, and particularly with our Supreme Court now, I think something like that would be struck down.
Okay, I'll try to answer for Oregon. The reason that we just have a prospective view of invalidating these covenants is that Legislative Council advised and the Attorney General's office advised both the legislature and our LCDC that this was fraught with constitutional problems. So they decided to take just a prospective view of these covenants. I'll move on to another question in the Q&A box, and I remind you, if you want to be heard, please do put that question in the box. This is from Nick Abbott, and I think it's much more directed to Chris than anybody else. How generalizable are the lessons from California? Should advocates in states without the same infrastructure, such as local YIMBY groups, sympathetic state government agencies, and the like, take a different path, like preemption? Or do you still think that the housing element type framework is still preferable? Chris?
So I think the housing element framework is good in one respect and bad in other respects. I think it is good to have a process whereby every 5 or 10 years, there is a state level review of local government's housing plans. And I think that periodic review is actually a good legal framework for engendering the growth of local YIMBY groups, right? It provides a focal point for organizing. It gives a chance for sort of big picture review of what's happening with land use and housing development rather than project by project review. But I think there are also some significant problems with the housing element framework as it's been designed in California, and relatedly, the planning frameworks in Oregon and Washington. I think the idea that we can forecast housing need based on population growth is ridiculous. As Jesse pointed out, we never know, when the next Amazon is going to appear or where. And as we see in California, there are places that have extremely high demand for housing, but very low household growth. The Marin counties, the Mercer Islands, right? And treating projected household growth as an indicia of need is just a mistake. To the extent that there is an indicia of need that we should be relying on, it should be price rather than forecasted household growth. And in particular, prices that are substantially higher than the labor and materials cost of construction. Because that's your indication of a housing shortage, right? That there is an opportunity to build housing that someone would be taking advantage of were it not for some local barrier that is preventing it, or a state level barrier that's preventing it from being built. So I would like to keep the basic structure of the framework, periodic review and and requirement to zone for a variety of housing types and requirements for plans for integration, but to change the focus of review from forecasted household growth to are your housing prices high, and what does it cost to build in your jurisdiction? And there should be an expectation that cities provide a lot more zone capacity and reduce barriers to construction when prices are high.
Okay, I'm going to ask Robert to go next, and then Jesse, if you have anything to add, please do. Robert?
I'd like to show people this, I don't know if people can see this now. If you're interested in a much deeper analysis that goes way beyond just allocating population, but to affordability, different demographic groups, go to this page, regional government, and you need to know that at the beginning, Oregon Metro are not perfect. It's being litigated right now, but the level of analysis of the type that Chris is describing, if you go to this page, this is the summary urban growth report, but if you look down here, there are hundreds of pages of appendix, including these things: housing needs analysis, employment and site characteristics. All of these are tracking. So there's a very detailed analysis about what are the incomes likely to be, what are the housing types that can be affordable, and where they're located. And I think it is worth, if you want to see a much more sophisticated analysis, I would take a look at this. The consequence of this politically, by the way, is that over time, the entities that objected to this is the regional government, which again has authority over local plans, has gotten so far ahead of anyone else, including the state, that no one can challenge this on a technical basis and keeps being updated. Again, it's still subject to politics, but I think this is quite useful. In the last year I was there, they actually did a projection about the household types, which was age, income, number of people in the household, their income, and where they would live, and what housing needs would fit if we didn't change the policies. So it's not perfect. I will say one other thing about Metro is in 1980, they did a forecast for their population in 2000. They were off by 2%. So they've been pretty good. And I think this level of sophistication is helpful. However, no level of sophistication, no level of numbers will substitute for political will.
Okay, Jesse? Do you want to add?
I don't have a ton to add other than, I think the regional, we have PSRC, Puget Sound Regional Council in Washington, which really has no real teeth to it. They also do a similar job as Metro, as creating these reports. It's just not required to follow any of them by the local jurisdictions. And so again, it becomes deeply political. And when your vote count in Mercer Island is 4,000 to win a city council seat, you're going to go with, the easy votes to get. So I think it's very difficult in Washington right now with what we have.
Okay, I'm going to follow up with a question to you, Jesse. Great presentation from Patience Malava. It is a fact that Washington is behind, and our GMA planning mechanism needs to change from the housing element goal language to give it teeth, and requiring local planning for diverse housing types for people of all income levels, and adding an accountability requirement or specific targets. Do you see an opportunity for the Washington State Legislature to deal with this, similar to Oregon's House Bill 2001 in the near future?
Hi, Patience. Patience probably knows the answer to that better than I do, actually. Patience works for the Housing Development Consortium, which is kind of the main convener of many of the providers in Washington State, and is doing a ton of work organizing the YIMBY and all of the different interest groups. So I want to give a shout out to that group and to Patience specifically. I really hope so, because we are not going to get the local accountability without actual requirements and without actual back checks. And, the group formerly known as Thousand Friends of Washington is now called FutureWise. In the past, so I was an intern for the Growth Management Hearings Board back in the day, back when I was in law school. And FutureWise was always the appellant on jurisdictions, comprehensive plans, and saying holding their feet to the fire. And at that time, it was really about battles over expansions of the urban growth boundaries. And I know that for various reasons, FutureWise has gotten away from those individual challenges. They're still focusing on expansions of urban growth boundaries when they do file challenges to the Growth Management Hearing Board, but there's nobody out there actually holding the jurisdiction's feet to the fire. So I think something like what Oregon has, and just having a model zoning act, that if you don't implement your local plan, this is what you're gonna get. I think that would be fabulous. Again, I think the cities and counties in Washington, they have great lobbyists. They have been some of the ones fighting hardest against things like that. So if we can overcome with some of the coalition that Oregon put together, I think that would be fabulous. And I think there is buy-in from some cities and counties now. Obviously there are great planners who really do deeply care about affordability. I think often it's the political leaders who still care about it, but at what cost politically. So that's what I would say. Patience, let's do it. Let's do it next year. Let's get Joe Fitzgibbons going on it.
All right, would either of our other panelists like to comment?
That's fine. No.
Okay. Let me go on to a question from Moe Newbold. Robert talked about how inclusionary zoning has led to about 700 units in Portland, but Oregon's law only allowed for IZ, inclusionary zoning, to apply to developments of 20 or more units, which seems to limit its applicability in smaller cities that are having challenges getting housing density to occur in the first place. Might implementing IZ in smaller cities, like Bend, where I'm from, with these restrictions lead to fewer apartments being built? What is the likelihood of expanding the ability to implementing IZ so that it might apply to more housing types in Oregon?
First of all, a little bit of the history. In the 1990s, when the Coalition for a Livable Future, which was focused on housing equity and environment on Metro, began advocating for inclusionary zoning, it was right at the point the Republicans took control of the legislature. And within months of us talking about this, they went and had it banned statewide. So the ban was only lifted fairly recently and only limited to certain communities where it can be applied. But the question that has been raised by people who really are advocates for housing is, this is a transfer cost between people. So you're going to raise some people's cost in order to provide housing for others. And if you do it too much, you're going to kill off housing production because they won't provide the necessary return for the market, which is building most of the housing. Well, and I'm going to get to your question. The equity issue is true, which is why not do this for groceries or medical services? Why not raise grocery prices 5% and then take a 50% reduction for other people? The question is, why is housing singled out? So I think that's a fairness issue. The problem is that the easiest response, say you should have a progressive tax system, redistribute benefits that way, which is politically difficult. This is easier. The city of Portland, I think there was questions about whether they're going to kill off housing production with this. And the results, I think, are good. I don't think inclusionary zoning generates a lot of units, but I think they've been pretty careful to limit how much they're going to exact out of the housing. So I think that's been successful. If it was going to be applied more generally, and in a place like Bend, where there aren't, till now, many apartments, buildings of 20 units or more, I think it needs to be applied then to large developments, like big subdivision proposals and so on. That would be the logical way of doing it. The other thing to do is that you can also have a voluntary inclusionary zoning, which doesn't really work well in Oregon. The idea is you can build more if some of them are affordable. So you're essentially financing the affordability unit by increasing the entitlement to the developer. The problem in Oregon has always been, we always want more development anyway, so there's nothing to give away in terms of entitlements because they've all been increased. It's a little bit of an overstatement, but that's still a possibility in some places and maybe in Bend, I don't know. So maybe to be a complete answer, and maybe my colleagues have some other things to suggest.
Okay, panelists, Chris?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. I am actually very concerned about the inclusionary housing phenomenon and the way it's playing out in California now. So I'm already hearing from talking with various advocates that cities that don't want new housing, even though they have to plan for a lot of it, are planning for it at the same time as they're really ramping up their inclusionary requirements. So some communities are now talking about 25 or 30% low income requirements, and they have to gin up a study to show that in theory a site can be developed with that requirement in place, or at least to justify on some sort of fanciful notion of gentrification impacts that this is actually responding to an effect of the new development. But you can hire consultants to do all sorts of things, and you can make assumptions about ever escalating housing prices that would make these super high inclusionary requirements economically feasible. And what I would really like to see, and I'm interested to hear from the Oregon and Washington folks if there's any discussion of this, I would like to see us move away from an exaction or a inclusionary zoning model where there's a condition attached to development, and instead towards a model where we try to extract the site value more directly, but with a mechanism that's not tied to, it doesn't require forecasting of what a house is going to sell for in the future. So a couple ways you could do that. One would be with a special assessment on upzoning, just like we do special assessments for infrastructure projects, where the city would calculate how much value is added to parcels by an upzoning, and then would charge a one-time tax, not keyed to any development, just keyed to the rezoning of the site on the landowner. A second model would be a land value tax advocated years ago by Henry George, which would be similar to a special assessment on upzoning, except instead of being a one-time charge, it would be like an annual tax akin to a property tax, but only assessed on the value of the land, not assessed on the value of any improvements. And a third model, which I've written about a little bit, would be to auction the development rights created by an upzoning plan. And then developers would calculate what they can make building a site on a site, and that would be reflected in what they bid for the auctioned allowances. But because the price would be determined through an auction, you could be sure that the price wouldn't be higher than what a developer could afford to pay while still making the minimum return they need for raising capital on the market that the developers rely on. So very interested to hear from other panelists as to whether there has been any movement in these directions in Washington or Oregon, because there really hasn't been in California, but I think we're heading into a train wreck.
Okay. Panelists?
In Washington, there has not. I will say the concern that we always have with the inclusionary zoning situation is whether or not it reduces overall housing production, which, I mean, I think we all can agree that we just need more housing. I mean, that's our basic thing. And then, figuring out, affordability, et cetera. But we just are very behind in the number of units that we have in Washington. And so I don't think that our cities have gotten that aggressive yet necessarily about those, ramping up their inclusionary requirements so much that that tamps down housing at all. What we have had in Washington are cities utilizing other parts of the Growth Management Act, namely concurrency requirements, to put in place such onerous transportation impact fees. I grew up in Federal Way. They did that school impact fees. It's $25,000 a door for new apartments in Federal Way. And that was determined to be okay by the Growth Management Board because it was, growth pays for growth, and there was definitely a need for schools. And of course, like Chris said, you hire a consultant to justify it with a study, and out pops your impact fee. And it truly was the city government not wanting any more apartments. That is why they did that, and frankly, the school district not wanting any more apartments. So I guess that's all to say that we've run into these issues in Washington, but we haven't gone to those creative methods yet. I mean, we're just trying to figure out the basics up here.
Robert, chance. Go ahead.
I was interested in the windfall tax idea tied to urban growth boundary expansions and wrote a paper about it. It was a time when the planning program was in abeyance, and this was an effort to try and reconstruct part of it. We voted on our statewide planning laws 7 times in Oregon. So we had millions of people participating in this. But anyway, when I worked on this windfall tax idea, one of the interesting points made was that if you do that, you tell everyone in advance what your formula is, and basically that gets backed out of the price. So what happens is that the speculator at the edge of the urban growth boundary gets a lower price because the tax is built in. And if you do that early enough, it's also a planning approach. People know what to expect, and a fairness approach. And what happens is that their profit is squeezed down. And so then the value then still allows for development. So that was a nice idea, which people listened to politely and then said, Council Liberty is off the deep end again. So it didn't go anywhere. But I think that I would say this about Henry George. For growth management planning in states like Oregon, Washington, California, that idea works inside urban areas. You do the opposite in rural areas, the exact opposite. You tax the structures much more highly and the land much less, and then reverse that in urban areas. So that principle has to be applied. Finally, I would say that a friend of mine who's a professor at the University of British Columbia, Patrick Condon, in the Vancouver region, the prices, they're like San Francisco without San Francisco incomes. I mean, it is jaw-dropping. So, a tear-down home on a 3,000 square foot lot is well over $1 million. And he thinks the system is basically broken and that there has to be a much larger intervention. He said, this is not about low-income people, it's about middle-income people and even upper-middle-income people who can't afford housing. So he's looked to example, a place like Vienna, where there's a chunk of the market is actually on publicly owned land with private development on it. And I won't go into all the details, but it's something I think we have to think about much bigger changes because this problem is just growing across the United States. And one of the criticisms of upzoning is, well, so people own property now are worth even more. I would say, by the way, as a counter to that is, wealthy people don't need to redevelop their homes. That's not who's building ADUs. It's middle class people. But there needs to be a way to allow someone with $30,000 or $40,000, a renter, she's been able to save that money over a couple of years to buy something into the market and to increase supply. Anyway.
Okay, I'm going to move on to another question. And this is from, I think, a Washington County planner, suburban area of Portland. The RHNA process, Regional Housing Needs Analysis process, highlighted the fact that the current HNA, the Housing Needs Analysis process in Oregon, reinforces existing exclusionary patterns. However, and also doesn't capture existing housing shortages. I'm not sure what my question is, but it's important to recognize that existing housing needs analysis model will perpetuate exclusionary patterns. I guess maybe I'm asking if anybody has a model that does a good job of including a mechanism for periodic evaluation and updates to our processes. I'll give it to Robert first and then move on to the others.
Well, I would, most of my career in Oregon has been based on the defects and failures of the Oregon planning program. That's the reality. There's so many things to fix. But I would disagree with the premise. The planning program has resulted in a lot of construction of apartments in Washington County, parts of Clackamas County suburbs that never would have been built. Now, those are enclaves, so they're economically segregated within the community. That's not ideal, but the fact that they're there is actually pretty impressive. So people in Washington County, which has a moderate income, low income Hispanic population, find more places to live. So I think the question is whether it goes far enough, and I'd say, well, no, of course not. I think there needs to be more pressure. Washington County was not a leader on these questions, I will say that. And some of its suburbs now are becoming leaders. So I think, again, you can do more, but what we see is the state having to step in and really mandate things. In fact, this is a direct parallel to what happened in rural lands, which the state kept pushing local governments to achieve objectives around protecting farm, ranch, and forest lands. They didn't happen. And if you look at our statute now, we have statewide rural zoning. That's really what it is. And that's where we're headed, because this basic problem of how local politics work. Finally, one other thing on this. Local officials celebrate local control as democratic, but if you ask people in these communities, who's your city councilor, they don't have any idea. And it's like the phrase bipartisanship in Washington. Actually, people don't give a crap about that. They may say they do. What they care about is the outcome, not whether someone they don't know, who they didn't vote for and didn't vote in the election, does something. So local control has to be challenged directly as a subordinate, not really important aspect of what's important to people. Sorry, I'm venting, but.
And before I move to our next panelist who wants to respond, Robert referred to rural zoning in Oregon. We have, I think, uniquely in the country, a minimum lot size of either 80 or 160 acres for our farm and forest areas. That is tremendous and reinforces the urban growth boundary and also the need within that urban growth boundary to accommodate all uses, particularly residential uses.
I have to say this, Ed, because I just gave a talk about this last night. That lot size does not entitle you to have a house. And the whole idea of lot sizes in rural areas is a borrowing from city zoning that has no place. The countryside is not destined to become a giant suburb. And that's how we treat it, lot sizes with houses on it. That is just the wrong starting point. So we have division standards, and then we have separate regulations of houses. And there's another area of imperfection. Anyway, more venting.
All right. Who wants to go next, Jesse or Chris?
I can jump in.
Sure.
I mean, if there's one thing that I would want to focus the analysis on in this periodic review process is, what is the labor, material, fees, exactions, IZ stack, right? What is all that cost to build a standard unit of multifamily housing? And the state could define what a standard unit is, like model projects. The Oregon fourplex bill is already going in this way, with defining standard projects types. This is a cottage cluster model. This is a townhome model, right? You could have a few standard types, standard project types, and then have the state housing agency audit construction costs for those project types in different jurisdictions. And then second, what is the market price of that standard housing type in different jurisdictions? And that would show you where there's both the demand for the housing, if it were allowed to be built, and also would show you where jurisdictions have, through stacking on various local requirements, have created unreasonable cost or unreasonable delay barriers to the construction of what should be relatively affordable housing in urbanized areas.
Jesse, you want anything?
No, I mean, I think that would be, I think that's a really, really great idea. I know California has started having the labor, not started. It's been an ongoing thing. Labor discussions are, they're now bubbling up in the context of these housing discussions. And I kind of wonder, how that either inflames or takes labor out of that equation in terms of being advocates for density. Because I think part of it is, I think we can all agree we really want people in all jobs to be making, a living wage. But there are costs associated with all of the, I call it a Christmas tree effect, right? Everybody's putting their ornament on the Christmas tree, and at some point the Christmas tree gets too heavy and is going to fall over. So where do we cut off, the decorating of the tree? Where, so I think it's all very interesting to hear about if we could change the way that just all of this, all of the supply is analyzed.
Okay. I'm going to modify a question from Chris Nelson. It's a two-part question. What remains missing in expanding affordable or inclusionary housing in your state? And what are the prospects for resolving them? And the second part of the question is there pushback from groups that want to roll back the recent legislation? Who wants to start?
I mean, I can start and just say yes. Well, I guess our recent legislation is so minimal that I don't know that there's a push to roll it back. And in Washington, the thing missing is the, I guess, the enforcement mechanism of all of this. We do have enforcement, but it has to be, FutureWise has got to fundraise and has to have, the political will to go and appeal these things, or somebody does. So that's what we're missing in Washington.
Okay.
Basic things.
Who's next?
Robert, do you want to speak next?
Okay. Well, is there pushback? Yes, there's always pushback. And I don't think it's going to be successful for a variety of reasons. The Democrats are just short of a 2/3 majority now. This is the speaker who was reelected, and she's a forceful advocate for it. There's always pushback, though. There's always a certain amount of retrenchment and then progress. What's missing? I think that what's really missing is checking and make sure we get the scale of production that will have an effect on prices. And there is a Up With Growth coalition, includes an economics firm from the Northwest. It's talked about, like in California, the volume you'd have to produce over 10 years to have an effect on prices. So I think we have to follow through to make sure there's volume. The second thing is we still have a huge mismatch between the type of housing in our households. So people still think they're building for nuclear families. Nuclear families are 25% of the households. So the adaptation of existing households, I think, is a big opportunity. And so, but how that happens for homeowners to become redevelopers of their own property, that's all new. I think a lot of that is a mixture of government and nonprofits and professional associations and development. So I'd say those things. And then I think we have to keep in the back of our mind is, really, is our system working at all? And in what ways are our tax systems thwarting progress, which have not been considered? And Oregon certainly borrowed a lot from California and its property tax initiatives, and they've made it hard to do the right thing in a lot of cases. So I'd say those are a couple things that are missing, plus this question about how do we help people of modest means actually get into housing, benefit from some of these changes.
Chris?
So there is pushback. There's a group called Livable California that is formed as a statewide anti-housing coalition or local control coalition. There has been talk about them possibly running a ballot measure that would constitutionalize local control in some form. We'll see what comes of that. As you may have heard, there was a bill that was reintroduced 3 years running that would have upzoned sites near mass transit statewide for 4 to 5 story buildings with a minimum under state law FAR, Florida area ratio. And the proponent of that bill, Senator Scott Wiener, finally gave up after 3 years. So that's evidence of, I guess you could call it successful pushback. In terms of what remains missing, I think the piece that is most missing right now is a way of providing greater assurances to existing residential tenants in neighborhoods that are being redeveloped that they're not going to be displaced by that redevelopment. There's a lot of anxiety over the asserted gentrification effects of new development in terms of raising rents on nearby properties. The empirical evidence is really contrary, with one very small exception, but pretty consistently contrary to that hypothesis. But it's a narrative that's very powerful. And I think the state needs to step up, or maybe the federal government needs to step up and address it. So one thing I would like to see is we already have a so-called right of return for people who are existing tenants in a building that's redeveloped, so that you can rent a new unit at your former rent in the redeveloped building. But there's no a source of rental assistance for the tenant who's displaced during the redevelopment period. So I'd like to see state or federal funding of rental vouchers for tenants in properties that are redeveloped, which would then make that right of return more meaningful, because you don't have to, move to Texas to afford a place to live in the interim. And possibly some form of rental insurance for tenants in areas that have been upzoned would also be valuable. So if your rents go up, you get a rent subsidy. If your rents go down, as the empirical evidence suggests they will, you don't get a subsidy. But providing that program would be incredibly cheap for the state, and would, I think, do a lot to diffuse local opposition to rezoning in urbanized areas.
All right, I think we've reached the end of our panel time. Would everybody give a virtual applause for our panelists? This was an excellent start for this symposium. And I'm now going to switch it over to Mark Hansen to start our break.
Hello, and thank you again to our first panel. It was really interesting. We're going to take a 15-minute break. Everyone, please come back at 10:15 for the start of our panel on housing equity, which is featuring Alan Lazo, Judge Peter Buxbaum, and Commissioner Anya Halova. That will be moderated by Professor Adam Shane. And current panelists, there's still some unanswered questions in the chat or the Q&A. Feel free to read through them, and you can answer them directly if you want. And again, let's be back at 10:15 for the start of our next panel on housing equity. Thank you.